Jennifer is back and Callie is here. So we are going to start with Jennifer and Callie. Jennifer?
Okay. Yeah, let me share my screen. Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Jennifer from George Washington University. My research is on the evolution of Konglish based on the current prevalence and South Korean public attitudes towards Konglish. And so I'll explore previous studies and literature regarding how widespread the use of Konglish is in South Korea and surveys of South Korean attitudes on the use of Konglish. And so by analyzing these two factors, we can begin to understand how Konglish will evolve in the future. And in doing so, I believe that Konglish will evolve to bear more resemblance to standard English in the future. And so there are three options that I looked at while conducting my research. And so the first option is that Konglish will continue to use a combination of English and Korean as they do today. Second, Konglish will evolve to resemble more like authentic Korean vocabulary. And third, Konglish will evolve to resemble that of standard English vocabulary. And so by analyzing, again, the prevalence of Konglish and the attitudes of the public in regards to Konglish, and that's what I'll be going over for my presentation. So this is where it gets a little bit complicated, like what exactly is Konglish? Some people think of it as a part of Korean culture and a way of speaking that should be used in informal settings. I've seen that other people describe it as a Korean variant of broken or imperfect English. So here you can already see the disparity in opinion of Konglish, and there really isn't a universal definition, but based on previous literature, can be commonly broken down into 5 different categories. But due to the time constraints, I won't be going over all 5 of the categories, but I will go over the last one, which is pseudo loanwords, as it's arguably the most controversial category of Konglish. So pseudo loanwords in the context of Konglish are English terms whose original definitions have become modified in translation when you look at it in the Korean context. So for example, the word obaite is derived from the English word overeat, but in the Korean context, it would be interpreted as vomit, right? So I suppose, I guess you could throw up because of overeating, but overeating doesn't necessarily mean to throw up. So you can see that there's a disconnect between how native English speakers and Korean speakers may interpret the word overeat. And so in understanding the variants of Konglish, we can begin to understand the complex attitudes towards Konglish in South Korea. So in South Korea, there is something that's described as English fever, which is due to the major emphasis of English education in South Korea. And you can see that because it's reported that Koreans will spend about 17 billion a year on private education, and this number is only growing. And so this emphasis on English education stems from societal pressure for students to perform well on standardized tests or interviews that measure English proficiency as a means to secure a successful job in a highly competitive market. And as such, there's a variety of problems that come from this. And so in one sense, students are starting to use more English terms in their daily lives, but we also see that this increases the amount of Konglish use. And this problem is only exacerbated by native English teachers who come to teach English in Korea. But studies have shown that while native English speakers know that pseudo loanwords aren't incorrect when translated to English, they will still adapt to Konglish despite its inaccuracies, because that's just the way that their students speak. So like if their English teachers are using Konglish on their students, it doesn't really quite help them learn standard English. And there's also cultural differences caused by the emergence of Konglish. And this is due to the Western and Korean culture conflict. So for example, Koreans have a respectful honorific term when addressing their teachers, but like in Western schools, you know, teachers are often referred to as Mr. or Miss followed by their last name, but in Korean culture that just doesn't happen to address their teacher by their name. So instead of addressing their teacher as like Mr. Kim or Mrs. Lee, students will often settle for addressing them as simply teacher, which would be kind of awkward if we did that in like a Western context. And so I also wanted to briefly talk about Konglish in popular culture because it does have a little bit of influence on Konglish. So English and Konglish is often used in TV and magazine brand advertisements, and it's really associated with high quality goods. And this is because of the US aid packages in the 1950s and that contain higher quality goods than that of the Korean goods at the time. And so Konglish in these advertisements were, and so like Konglish that's used in Korean advertisements often aren't like an accurate representation of standard English definitions and are more for like aesthetic appeals. And then there's also Korean pop music, otherwise known as K-pop, and it's produced to appeal to both Korean and global audiences. So Konglish lyrics are often intermixed with Korean lyrics in K-pop for like stylistic purposes or to bridge a familiar communication to other countries listening to K-pop. And so I also wanted to highlight the study by Sophia Rudiger, when she asked university students between ages 19 to 30 about their attitudes towards Konglish. And so when asked, what do you think about Korean people who use many English loanwords when speaking Korean, the majority had a mixed response, where they felt that the excessive use of Konglish was unflattering, but admitted that Konglish is sometimes better for expressing certain feelings or messages. And 23% said that they had a negative perspective, with the main reason being that they felt a sense of betrayal to Korea when using Konglish words, or that the people who do use them are only trying to, show off their English. And those who had a positive outlook said that they were simply comfortable with using a lot of Konglish in their vocabulary. And this leads me to talk about the mixed attitudes towards Konglish. And this mainly derives from concerns regarding South Korean students in their English education. So many English language teachers have expressed that the prevalence of Konglish deters students from adjusting to English pronunciations and English definitions. And so a lot of teachers currently are working towards developing strategies and activities that help students distinguish from Konglish and standard English. And then Konglish has also been problematic in the professional setting, where former President Park Geun-hye received backlash for her poor grasp of English when she advocated for the National Assembly to pass economic bills so that the Korean economy would not lose golden time. But what she actually meant to say was, precious time. And so many Koreans expressed concern that these errors in English in a highly publicized setting is both embarrassing and shameful. But some benefits to Konglish that I've noted down is that people have found Konglish helpful in advancing their Korean studies, or other Konglish enthusiasts see it as giving Koreans a broader range of vocabulary to better express themselves. And so after analyzing the prevalence of Konglish and attitudes towards Konglish, I found that the first option, that Konglish will continue to use the same combination of English and Korean, just isn't very likely, because language is always continuously evolving, and with the current generation of students and people that recognize that Konglish is comprised of pseudo-loanwords and has its faults, many have demonstrated a willingness to change. And so for the second option, it's also highly unlikely that it will evolve to resemble authentic Korean vocabulary, because studies have shown that the people who believe this are in the minority, and that those who do have a negative response is mainly because of Konglish's inaccuracies. And so that leads me to say that Konglish will evolve to resemble that of standard English vocabulary. And I just wanted to clarify that this doesn't necessarily mean that Konglish will disappear or anything like that. I think it's very deeply rooted in South Korean culture at this time, as you can see with its wide prevalence. But because people are recognizing its inaccuracies and there are steps being made to change it, I think that there will be more of I think Konglish and Standard English will become more distinguished, and so it will grow to, get rid of those inaccuracies, or at least try to. Okay, and yeah, that's it for my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next is Callie.
Right, and I will be playing a recording of Callie's presentation, so if everyone could again mute your video and microphone, I'll get that started.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Callie Rhodes, and today I will be discussing multiculturalism in the media through the popular reality TV show, The Return of Superman. So basing off of cultivation theory, or the idea that media affects our worldview, I had a few questions. What does a show that is just quote-unquote for fun bring to a discussion on multicultural families instead of a documentary? And what does a show about fatherhood do for the discussion on multiculturalism that a show about multicultural families does not? So to give a little background on multicultural policy in Korea, many of the policies or policymakers expect that multicultural children will be raised as Korean rather than siding with their foreign heritage or being given that choice, but at the same time expects them to be bilingual and through this eventually benefit Korea in some manner with their global heritage. However, in many multicultural households, the foreign spouse is not allowed to speak their native language, so the child is either forcibly separated from that part of their heritage, or due to bullying and discrimination, they feel that they cannot identify as a multicultural child to avoid bullying. And furthermore, multicultural families have generally low incomes, with around 70% of families reporting the equivalent of less than $2,000 a month as their income. So these families cannot afford private education, nor can they afford higher education that would be required in order for these children to become the benefit to Korea's economy that the policy is looking for. Okay, so for this paper, I analyzed 10 episodes of The Return of Superman, specifically looking for, 1, the way the show points out the park's exceptionalism compared to the average multicultural family, 2, the scenes wherein the show has to balance valuing the children's Korean heritage but finding a way to devalue often their Korean speaking ability, and 3, places where the show puts special emphasis on the fact that these children have foreign heritage. So to begin with exceptionalism, some of this should be pretty obvious, but the father, Park Chuo, is a professional soccer player. His net worth has been placed at around $7 million, and he has played abroad, namely Europe, for most of his soccer career. The mother, Anna Park, is a white European and highly educated, which makes her an outlier among other foreign spouses in Korea. If you couldn't guess from this alone, The Return of Superman has made it quite clear that the family is well off. In their first appearance, the show marvels over their clean and modern apartment for a good 5 minutes of a 20-minute segment. Furthermore, Anna does not work by her own choice. instead choosing to raise her children as a stay-at-home mom, which is again a choice that sets her apart from other foreign spouses who work out of necessity. As I mentioned earlier, the show regularly praises moments where the Park children are shown to prefer their Korean side, but because the children are so young, these moments often only revolve around their preference for Korean food. For example, in their trip to Switzerland, the show turns a moment that could have been about how global and cosmopolitan their upbringing is, basically, how well they can also eat traditionally Swiss food, into a moment where the show basically says, of course they prefer Korean-style food. They're Korean after all, because the children decide to eat dry seaweed instead of fondue, which they do not look happy about. But when it comes to Naon's Korean fluency, the show regularly points out her pronunciation. For example, in one 10-minute scene in an episode, there were over 20 instances where the captions purposely misquoted Naon with a TH in place of the S sounds, like you see in this picture. Although the show says it's because of her cute childish voice, they have also actually given this treatment to her mother's Korean, which tells me that it's not actually entirely because she's a cute little kid. To summarize my point here, multicultural children who favor their Korean heritage have to be valued as Korean children, but they can't be the same as a fully Korean child, so the show praises the children for assimilating, but picks out where they fail to be the same as a fully Korean child their age. Finally, although The Return of Superman is a show about fathers, the mother Anna is often shown in episodes that feature her children. Anna is often either shown physically or she'll call her husband in multiple episodes, even after she is supposed to have already left. If you're considering that the show allows Anna's reappearances to air in order to remind the audience that the children are multicultural, this makes sense, partly because without Anna, the children could pass as just being fully Korean children, and also because in the other multicultural family that is on the show at the same time, the father is the foreigner and the reminder that their multicultural is constant. Furthermore, Anna reinforces that her children are exceptional because she does not speak to them in Korean, she does not call them by their Korean names, and in turn, they do not speak to her in Korean, making her husband the only person in the family to regularly speak to the kids in Korean. What shocked me the most about how the show navigates the park's global heritage was when they went to Switzerland. First of all, the dad did not join them on the trip, and Naon was left responsible for translating pretty much everything into German, doing things like buying things in the weekend market, reading maps. Despite the fact that they were left in the care of another celebrity, this particular celebrity has only a limited fluency in English, and the show did not seem to hire a translator despite the fact that they were going to Lucerne. To me, this turns Nan's fluency from something that is kind of casually amazing for a child her age into something that is literally valuable to the situation that they're put into. In a sense, Nan shows her worth almost as a multicultural and multilingual child, even at the young age of 4, in a way that aligns with what the government aspires multicultural children in Korea to grow into. Excuse me. In conclusion, what makes the part so interesting to me is that at times it feels like the show is compensating for something through focusing on their lingual fluency or letting the mom come back on the show to remind the audience that these children are not fully Korean. Because without it, it would look like another family with a Korean father and 2 Korean children. The Korean viewers get the message that the children are Korean at heart, but are also reminded of how exceptional their upbringing is. The show's produced image of the parks reflects the dichotomy that is seen in multicultural policy in Korea by showing them as both Korean and global citizens. In a sense, Superman is communicating to the average Korean viewer that there's nothing to fear in the growing population of multicultural children in South Korea. The park children are a perfect example of everything the Korean government aspires to have in a multicultural child and more. And the show also ensures that there's no reason to worry about Korea's status as a quote-unquote culturally homogenous nation. There's nothing to worry about that's fading, because these children, despite not being fully Korean by blood, are so well adjusted to being fully Korean at such a young age. Thank you.
Okay, people can come back, and both Jennifer and Callie are here, so you can ask questions to both of them.
I have a question for Jennifer. Yeah, so it seems like the way you laid out Konglish is that there is a separate kind of a category called Konglish and then Korean, and then you were kind of looking at how the Koreans react to the separate entity. But my question is, what about words that Koreans don't even know it's Konglish? Maybe it's not even Konglish, meaning it's not English. The root is in different languages. So for example, Koreans don't even think twice about the word taxi, menu, or bang. Bang is not actually a Korean word, right? And yet in Korea, nobody thinks bang as a foreign word, right? Unless you really have to think about it and someone points it out to them. Koreans use it as if it is a Korean word. So yes, there are loan words like that, and plenty more that came from Japan, by the way. But this isolated category of Konglish deriving from English, you know, how do you see that when eventually it'll become almost part of the language and people won't even think twice about it?
If I could just piggyback.
That's a really good question.
Just a second, Jennifer. Yeah, Siddhartha.
Yeah, since I'm closely connected, if I could just piggyback on that, it seems like you're kind of conflating loan words that people understand are loan words and Konglish, which has become more integrated into the thing. And actually, Sophia Rudiger, or however you pronounce her name's research, that paper that you're citing, when she's talking about that chart that you showed, the table that you showed, she's talking about loan words. She's talking about people feeling upset when somebody uses advanced English or other foreign vocabulary in a Korean conversation. She's not talking about people saying, you know, juice or ice cream. She's not talking about that. She's talking about all of a sudden saying hegemony or something like that in the middle of a Korean conversation. So these are two different things. So I mean, I think you need to like kind of explain. Yeah.
Okay, Jennifer.
Okay, yeah. So those are really good questions, and I think that's something that when I was doing my research, I also had a really hard time understanding. And right, and that's right, because it's so heavily integrated, like how do you really even talk about Konglish in that sense? So like I understand that there's like other loanwords that derive from like Japanese or Chinese and whatnot, and I think like that's kind of the hard thing that I really tried to tackle when I was doing my research, and unfortunately I didn't really have a lot of time to talk about it in my presentation. But yeah, like I think when I was doing my research, I had like a lot of difficulty trying to understand the differences, and because like I'm not, like I barely know a lot of Korean, like I also had really like a difficult time. And so that was, I think the questions that you raised would definitely just be like my limitations while I was doing my research.
Okay, Summer, you had a question?
Yeah, I have another question for Jennifer. So I see with this increased prevalence of Konglish in the Korean language, North Korean defectors who go to South Korea, they often have a hard time adjusting and learning this new form of Korean that they're not used to. And I'm wondering if that's the same problem that maybe older generations in Korea face, and if so, how do they get over this transition, this adaptation?
Yeah, I actually did talk a little bit. I do talk a little bit about North Korean defectors in my research paper, and like, right, you're right. Like they really do have a hard time because not only are they learning, just learning culture, they also have to learn this like adapted language that they're not used to. And I think for like the older generation, I feel like they do have some difficulties as well, but there's also, at least from my research, I've read that they've had at least some exposure, at least from those who've had exposure to like the US military that's been stationed there in like the 1950s. And English has only been growing in South Korea, at least since then. And then there was also Park Chung-hee's reign where he really started to emphasize on English education, and eventually the 1990s where English education was mandated. And so I think in terms of the older generation, they do, I think, have difficulty, I think just like with any generation where language is always evolving and new vocabulary is being, I guess, like created as language evolves.
Okay, any questions for Callie?
Yeah, I have a question for Callie. Thank you for your presentation, by the way. And I'm just wondering if you, in your research, if you looked at any portrayals of different kinds of multicultural families, for example, you know, more typical families where one, you know, the mother is from Vietnam or the Philippines, and if you can talk a little bit about how that portrayal is different, or what, if you noticed anything about differences.
Sure,
Yeah.
can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before picking The Return of Superman, I was actually looking at a couple shows like that where they're a little more recent because there's a lot of literature on like Love in Asia, which is a little older, but has that kind of format where it does more quote unquote like average families. But I found that the shows that I could find didn't really focus on one family in particular, like they would move between families. So I was more interested in finding a show that happened to pick a family and kind of have the focus on it for more than like one episode or one segment of an episode even.
Jisoo? Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a follow-up question to Callie, and then I also have one quick question to Jennifer as well. So Callie, you know, multiculturalism or 다문화 가정 in Korea became a big loaded term. What is, like, now having done this research in Korean context, can you explain how you understand multiculturalism in Korean context? Because obviously the way it's been used in Korea is different from the way we understand here. And I have a question to Jennifer. So one thing that I really, whenever I hear this, when I go to Korea, downtown Seoul, and see this mark, I Seoul you, this is something that I really kind of, you know, always get, I don't know, I mean, it just bothers me because it just doesn't make sense. And one summer, my students, I went to, lead summer program with my GW students, and they had this, like flea market thing in Cheonggyecheon, and they put everything, not just so I sold you, but they like I market you, and students were like looked at that, and they were just like, wow, what is that in the middle of Cheonggyecheon? They saw that mark, I sold you, and what does that mean? So so would that be part of how would you understand all this kind of different usage of English in Korean context?
Okay, that's a good question. And like those are the kind of like signs that I guess that another part of that I think that I talked about in my community research is like those kind of signs where it just like doesn't really make sense. And so when I thought about it, I kind of put it together as like another, I guess, section of like Konglish that and I might be wrong about this, but like another section of Konglish where like the things like grammatically just doesn't make sense if you use it in that way, or like another English term that's being misused. And like that's kind of how I understand it, but again, like I guess like for me, my Korean is really limited, and it's really hard to define like Konglish or like English loanwords or what are loanwords, and so yeah, that's how I would see it.
Callie, could you respond to Professor Kim?
Yeah. To answer your question, what I kind of found through doing my work is that a lot of what they kind of aim the policies towards and stuff is not what I would have considered to be entirely inclusive of like the whole scale of a multicultural family. Like kind of like I said in my presentation, like a lot of the things that they're working towards are working through this idea that it's a Korean father, a foreign wife, and then their kids, rather than including like migrant workers and their kids or things like that.
Okay, so I unfortunately need to get off due to another meeting. So Professor Kim at GW will continue moderating. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we have a lot of